Well, it's my pleasure to introduce Megan Parker, who's the forest planner with Scottish Woodland Limited, who are managing and designing the project at Glen, south of Clochnaben, which I take it most of you are aware of, otherwise you wouldn't be here. Clochnaben is, of course, one of the iconic hills in the northeast of Scotland, and the change of ownership there is likely to be of great interest to everybody in this part of the world. So I know Megan's been involved in this for some time now. I heard her out in the field last year, and I'm sure she's given other presentations to other groups. So I'll say no more now, but to invite her to take the stage. Over to you, Megan.
That's great, thank you. Hopefully I don't have too much of an echo after my microphone adjusts here. Thank you so much for inviting me this evening to kind of give you a talk about Glen Moor and the projects that we have planned there. And kind of this is intended to be sort of just an update of where we are in the process. We still have a ways to go. It is a big site, so we've got a lot to take into account, but hopefully tonight you'll get an idea of where we are and hopefully get some of your questions answered and things like that. I'll kind of give you a bit of background on me, just so you know kind of what I do. I am a senior forest planner working for Scottish Woodlands, and I focus on our North region, although I do have projects throughout Scotland. So as part of that, I basically look at projects at scale and holistically, and I try to match up client and landowners' objectives with what's available that can actually be implemented on their ground. So Glen Moor is an exciting project for me because of the scale of it. It provides a lot of opportunity to do a lot of really good things. So the Glen Moor projects, as most of you hopefully will be aware, having maybe looked at the website or perhaps attended the public drop-in sessions that we did last year, there's three components to this project. One is peatland restoration, one is woodland creation, and the other one is what we're calling community proposals or people projects. So it's kind of a multifaceted kind of combination of things that we're doing at Glen Moor. We're trying to do at Glen Moor, still early days. So I'll go through each thing and then give you a bit of background about what we actually mean when we talk about peatland restoration, woodland creation, and community proposals, and then a little bit about where we are, what we found out so far in our development. And then at the end, we'll have plenty of time for lots of questions and discussion if we want to get into any specific topics in detail. So hopefully I can get this to forward. There we go. So if you did get to attend the public drop-in sessions last year, you may recall one of the boards had this sort of flow chart to it. And it's the approach that we take for all of our projects. There's always a sort of concept stage where we think about, you know, what might be able to happen on a site. And then we go through and we do the survey work. Currently, the concept stage is fully fleshed out now. Part of that was our public consultation last year. The survey work is, I would say, 90% completed. We are still waiting on a little bit of the feasibility study for the peatland to kind of hash out exactly which areas we'll be targeting for the restoration. But the vast majority of the survey data is now in, and we are well into the design stage of this process. And that's really where I get to take everything we've found so far, kind of digest it a bit, and really start to plan out some of the detail of various projects and various elements, and making sure that we account for all the sensitivities and the constraints that we've found so far in our sort of due diligence work up to this point. So we still have a lot of work to do. The review stage of this project will be both public and statutory bodies, so Scottish Forestry and SEPA and Nature Scot and the Council. But there will be a public consultation period that will also occur as applications are submitted to those bodies. So it will be quite a sort of extended period of review for the various elements of the projects. And then once that's all agreed and everybody's happy, we can finally start actually putting trees in the ground, putting diggers in the peat, and putting things in place as far as the people projects go. So still a bit to go, but happy to give you all an update of what we found so far. So I'll start on the peat side of things. So we do have our habitat survey completed for the entire ownership. We also have a terrestrial ecology survey completed. A lot of our surveys are now completed. And I thought I'd show you a bit of a map and sort of chart as to what is there. Won't be surprising for most of you. You've probably spent time out there and walked this ground. So you'll know that quite a lot of it is heath, some of it wet heath, some of it dry heath. And about 40% of it is bog, wetland, some variety of sort of saturated habitat. So it's really split into those two sort of broad categories of habitats. We do have some areas of grassland and bracken, and there are some woodlands that are out there and a few other things, but the vast majority is either heath or bog. And in varying stages of condition as well. So when we talk about peatland restoration, I think it's important to kind of understand what we mean when we talk about that. So there's a photo there at the bottom of the top, one of the higher elevations of Glen Moor, and you can see there's quite a lot of peatland in that view, and it's quite heavily eroded there. So when we talk about peatland restoration, what we really mean is taking those areas where the plant communities that depend on being there and erosion has happened or some sort of functionality has been impaired in the habitat, we go into those areas and we basically either revegetate them or re-wet them, depending on what they need. So it's the restoration is really the process of getting that system functioning again. So getting the plants back where they need to be and getting them wet enough so that they can actually begin doing the work that they did before, which was storing loads and loads of carbon, which also helps with the whole climate emergency. So it's a very critical element to get right for this proposal, because we have a lot of degraded peat, as you can see in that photo. So as far as how we actually accomplish peatland restoration, there's a lot of different methods that are used, and it sort of depends on what we've got to start with. So if we kind of zoom into some of that ground that we saw in the other photo, we can see there's varying degrees of degradation. Some of it's quite far gone. We can see in some of those smaller photos, both in the top and bottom there, the peat's all but gone. It's down to sort of a sandy substrate. So there's some areas where the feasibility study is going to tell us whether or not it's capable of being recovered, or whether we have to kind of take a different tact. It would be great to recover 100% of the peatland at Glen Moor, but we have to take consideration of the long-term sustainability and the impact of actually doing the restoration in some of these areas. So the feasibility study, which is almost completed, is going to target the areas where we actually can accomplish really good benefits. So we want to accomplish a net environmental gain with the peatland restoration. So that feasibility study is really to identify the areas where we can expect, full recovery and really make an impact into getting some of that carbon that's been released stored back into the peatlands. So there's a couple different methods that we normally use. Drain blocking is a very common one, but there's actually not a huge amount of drains at Glen Moor. So most of our restoration work will probably focus more on reprofiling and revegetating. So this video here, which is slightly sped up, is showing a digger basically revegetating an area that they've reprofiled. So there was a vertical face there below him, and he's basically made a nice slope out of that. And then he's now taking sort of turves of vegetation from around the place and placing it on that exposed peat. And over time, it will reroot into that peat. It will keep it from drying out, and it will keep that carbon that's there sort of in place so it stops eroding. So those two strategies of reprofiling and revegetating, I think, will be quite prevalent on Glen Moor once we actually get into the work and start doing it. But again, the feasibility study that's going on right now is looking at these specific things all over Glen Moor. And so it will identify exactly which techniques will be appropriate to which areas. And of course, Nature Scott will also have a say in sort of the methodology that's used. So anything that we decide to do will be agreed by them before we start doing it. This isn't Glen Moor, by the way, this video. No work had started there yet. But it's a good video to kind of help explain what we mean when we talk about revegetating and reprofiling. So hopefully that's useful. Woodland creation. It's very much an iterative process. This map that I've got up here is one of the maps that we used during the consultation exercise. It's one of the concept maps, and the green areas were appropriate, but it was where we did all the surveys and things. So to explain kind of how we end up making our final decisions for woodland creation, we have to go through quite a complex process of seeing what the sensitivities are and then removing those and mitigating for those sort of sensitivities. So that habitat map we had up earlier, this is all the areas of that habitat map that are not suitable for planting trees or where we don't expect natural regeneration will occur. So these areas we just automatically will take out of any green areas that you saw on the previous map because they just aren't suitable. Then we look at things like landscape. This is what's called a line of force map. And it's identifying the landform features that are quite strong and pronounced. And we have to make sure that any woodland we create in this landscape sits in a sympathetic way to the landforms and the landscape sensitivities that are here. So that could be things like viewpoints, Clochna Ben being a really important one, or inner visibility of summits, things like that. So how we design the look of the forest will take into account things in the landscape like this. We also have to look at peat depth. So this is a peat depth map. It's a model of the peat depth at Glen Moor. So anything over 50 centimeters, we will not be planting. So we have to make sure we know where all those areas are and then remove them from the proposal from that woodland design. Along with that, we also have archaeology. So there is a bit going on at Glen Moor. Most of it's at the lower elevations, but there are a few sites further up. And we just have to make sure that we don't compromise those sites in any way. So the archaeologist we had out has given recommended buffers for sites that need protection. So we have to incorporate those into the woodland design as well. And this is a rather confusing map, but it's basically looking at some features of terrestrial ecology, so mammals, birds, things like that. And this is basically to indicate that there are sensitivities out there that we have to take into account. For example, ground nesting birds, we may need to leave areas open for them so that their habitat isn't taken away once trees start growing in. So we have to take that into account. And all of these things sort of combine to an updated green area of potential woodland. This map isn't complete. I haven't actually put all of those buffers into it yet, but I've started to. So some of it has been adjusted now, and there's less green than there would have been on the iterative process of looking at what we've seen on the ground. this map will adjust and start to transition into more what it will look like at its final stage. So just putting the two side by side, they're not drastically different at this stage. All of the habitat information is taken into account so far, but the landscape appraisal will also kind of shape some of those upper edges a bit more. So it will continue to change as we work our way through the design process. And I suppose it's also important when we talk about woodland creation, this is just a wash of green, but it actually encompasses a variety of woodland types. There will be a third of the site planted with conifer, which will be productive, and the rest of the woodland will be native. But within those native areas, we also expect to have some natural regeneration. So in the sort of smaller photo there on the screen, you can see there's a little birch tree that's just made it up above heather height. And assuming we keep the browsing pressure low, that tree should grow in without any issues. So where we have natural regeneration already occurring, we want to encourage that to continue. And it's really important for us to predict where the natural regeneration in future will be. So we go out and we will be mapping all of the seed sources, like the other photo that's on the screen, where we have some scattered trees running up a watercourse. And once we know where all of those seed sources are, we can predict how far the seed will cast, and then we can leave those areas open so that they can naturally spread out. But beyond that sort of distance of where we would expect seed to go, we do have to kind of help nature along so that we get a woodland established quickly. So we will be planting beyond those boundaries. But what we plant will depend a lot on what the native mixtures of woodland are. So we will look at the combination of trees up this gully, for example, and then plan a species composition for planting nearby that mimics that and other native woodland types throughout the area. Similarly, in the smaller photo here, you can see in the background, there's a lot of conifer standing on the neighboring estates. So where we do plant commercial conifer, we want to make sure that we interlock that into existing plantation wherever possible. So we're not going to put conifer completely out on its own. It's only going to be where it makes sense to interlock into existing plantations, just to continue that sort of network of forest cover. And then once we have some designs a little bit more progressed, we can start to visualize those. So this is a 3D model of one part of Glen Moor. Once we kind of know where our trees are going to go, we can project how they're going to look on the landscape. We can visualize that. And this enables us to sort of see if potentially there's landforms that we want to maybe make more visible that seem quite shrouded in forest. So it gives us an opportunity to kind of have a final look at what it might actually appear like on the ground and make final adjustments that we might need to make at that point. So it's kind of a finishing touch portion of the woodland design. So that kind of brings us on to sort of people projects. And I think that it's worth kind of explaining what I mean by community and what I mean by community projects. So the general sort of, not definition, but the loose idea that I kind of pulled together when I think about community for Glen Moor is kind of the people and the groups who visit or utilize Glen Moor. And that could be for leisure, for inspiration, for health, for research and learning, for any reason, working out on site. All of these people are sort of, and groups are what I consider to be the community that we're thinking about for Glen Moor. And the projects that go along with that are incredibly varied and diverse. They're all led from suggestions we've gotten. So it's a very long list. of interesting projects. I'll list a few of them just to give you a flavor of what's been submitted to us. So parking improvements has been a pretty strong one. Things like composting toilets were suggested. A scout camp, so an area where scouts can camp, complete with hammock trees planted so they can put their hammocks up. We've gotten a request for ranger programs, continued use of the existing rifle range on the site, sharing of the cultural heritage surveys with local cultural heritage groups, posting signs about bird species that are on the site, sensitive nesting periods, things like that to educate people. Also long-term research projects. A few groups have been interested in developing those. School group tours, and it just goes on. So that kind of gives you an idea of just some of the many different types of projects we're looking at. Now, community projects are a really interesting one because they are so varied and so different, and they require such a broad variety of resources to implement. So we've got to really think about which projects we move forward with. So a bit about how we kind of decide that. So this is also a picture of Charbothy, in case you don't know, which hopefully everybody does. But this was one of there were quite a few suggestions about Charbothy and what it should be used for. Half of it is currently open to the public and half of it is locked, and it's available for private use for the landowner. So this was one of the sites where, you know, we had to think about what was being put forward for it and what sort of projects we could actually kind of bring on board and agree and make and implement, basically. So when we're evaluating those sorts of decisions, we look at the current use of the site as a whole and whether the project will significantly alter current use. So obviously we don't want to restrict use in any way with any projects, but we also don't want to encourage or expand use beyond what the site can sustain. That's quite important. So we have to balance, kind of look at each project as to what degree of change we could expect. That helps us make a decision. We also look at the logistics of implementing each of these projects. So what resources are needed? How difficult will it be to actually implement? And then very importantly, we look at long-term sustainability. So